Hey everybody, thank you so much for joining us here today at Upstream. We are celebrating all things open source. I've got an amazing group of folks here on the panel today, and we are going to talk about the life after XZ. As everybody probably attending this conference knows, there was a pretty major potential software supply chain attack that recently happened. And so we wanted to gather voices from around industry to speak with folks that have different perspectives on what happened and what happens next. So I'm going to round robin to get our guests to introduce themselves. And I'm going to start with Rachel Stevens from RedMonk.
Everyone, I'm Rachel Stevens. I'm a senior analyst with RedMonk, and we focus on developer-led technology adoption trends.
Thank you. And then if I could go to you, Shaun.
Yes, my name is Shaun Martin, and I'm a principal of BlackIce Solutions, and we're a cybersecurity consulting company that's focused on helping organizations manage risk within their organizations.
Great. And Josh Bressers.
Yes, I'm Josh. I'm the vice president of security at a company called Anchore. We do next generation source composition analysis. And I've been kind of doing this open source thing about forever. I've got a podcast called the Open Source Security Podcast, and XZ has been, holy cow, what a wild ride.
Yes, your podcast was key listening for me when it came out.
Awesome.
So next we have an open source maintainer with us, Jordan Harband.
Hi, I'm Jordan. I am currently an architect at Hero Devs, but my sort of long-time career has mostly focused around maintaining open source. I have 500 or so NPM packages and VMs. It's quite a lot. I'm very familiar with the type of behavior that contributed to the XZ attack, so I'm very happy to talk about it. Yeah. It's also just being on the internet, right? So yeah.
Great. And then last but not least, thank you, Jordan, we have Terrence Fischer here is joining us from Boeing. Terrence, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, yes, Terrence Fischer, the Boeing company, senior principal security engineer, mainly focusing in the vulnerability management space with a little bit of IR.
Nice. Well, thank you all again for joining us here today, especially if you're maintaining 500 NPM packages. We appreciate you making the time. So just as a quick background for anybody who's not familiar with what happened with XZ, or just as a refresher, so we had a situation where there was a solo maintainer, Lassie Collin, on a prominent package way down deep in what ultimately ends up at the Linux distribution, several Linux distributions. There was a multi-year and actually multi-stage attack that was set up, a backdoor attack where there was some social engineering involved. There was a particular contributor to the project who began to kind of harass the maintainer, point out where work wasn't getting done quickly enough, and essentially created a pathway to become added as a co-maintainer onto the project. There were other personalities that may or may not have been fake, also kind of chiming in and piling on this maintainer, sort of saying this stuff's not happening fast enough, we need to move. And it turns out that underneath all of that, there were these different levels of vulnerability that had been put in place into the code and the code around the project. And ultimately, if this hadn't been caught in time, it would have gone out most likely into several Linux distributions at scale. The reason it was caught, developer at Microsoft happened to notice that usage of, I think it was OpenSSL. Sorry, OpenSSL, we love you. OpenSSL was running 4 milliseconds slower, right? So this is something that was really caught by a gnat's eyelash, as we would say in the South. And so that's where we are today to have this discussion about what this means about software and vulnerabilities and the people that are behind the projects that are in these supply chains. So for my guests here, is there anything you would think our audience needs to know additionally about this multi-stage attack that was laid?
Me, it's setting up that this was years in the making. I think that's part of the thing that makes it interesting and a little concerning for everyone involved in terms of just the depth of effort that went into this.
Yes,
Yeah,
and then to add to
absolutely.
that, the inability to detect that there was some wrongdoing happening for so long. So not having even the visibility to even detect if there was any malicious activity happening.
Yeah, I think you got all the main ingredients of a really strong social engineering attack. You've got, the urgency, we got to go, go, go. And then you've got, emotions being pushed, and you've got a legitimate, quote unquote person offering help. And so, it's really believable. And I think that was the, oh my goodness, for me.
Yeah, yeah. So I wonder if I could start with you, Terrence, and ask each of you, what if you could share, if you can recall, what was your first kind of in the moment reaction when you heard about this and the kinds of roles that you all have in your day to day?
Yeah, like Rachel mentioned, the amount of effort and the patience and setting up this type of infrastructure with whether it be single use accounts or doing the bad cop, good cop, bad cop thing, and playing off of each other on the team. I think initially my response was, okay, is this the whole story? And if it is, then how do we how do we communicate this to our weekly tag up group? And so did the best that I could. I think I kind of relayed, this is a very in the weeds things, but it has a very, very real implication on our assets potentially, and it almost worked. So that's the scary part.
Yeah. And Josh, I know you had a very long couple of days in your role and then hopped on Easter Sunday to record an
Yes.
episode of your podcast about it. Tell us about your first reaction.
That's right. I mean, so it was very funny, actually. I was off visiting colleges with my oldest, and this happened, and I basically just like sat down at my computer and I told my family, I said, I'm busy doing something. Just Google for this thing called XZ. Don't talk to me for a while. And the first reaction I had, in all seriousness, was the terror of people overreacting and blaming open source and saying it's insecure and it's bad, and we shouldn't use it. And it's like any sort of emergency, right? There's always that like knee jerk overreaction that happens. And the reality is, open source is everywhere and it's irreplaceable at this point. Like, there's no way to take it out. There's nothing anyone can do in that respect. And so the reason I recorded a podcast right away was just there were so many people contacting me saying, what the heck is going on? What do I need to do? Because it's really hard in these situations to untangle what's actually going on. There's hot takes everywhere. Everyone has an opinion. There's misinformation. It runs the gamut. And so the guy I do the podcast with, his name is Kurt. I said, Kurt, like, we have to record something right now, and we're going to do our best to like just, slice through all of the nonsense and just explain what the heck is going on and what do you need to do? If I'm a person, what does it mean to me? And the reality for most people, it was nothing, but that's hard to convey, right? It's hard to understand that. So it was, yeah, it's been a wild, wild couple of months for sure.
Mm-hmm. Shaun, did you also have clients of yours coming to you in a bit of a panic?
Actually, not really, and I'll tell you why. So I'm on the whole risk management and compliance side of cybersecurity. So that's the part that set up policy and frameworks to protect the organization against risks such as these. But a lot of my clients are really focused on the boundary, right? The network, cloud, and and securing those areas, because one of the most critical cyber controls are a boundary defense. So we know that. So that's really where we start. So the reason why I started getting more into open source and a lot of the exposure, because for so many years as practitioner, application security was more like a second guess, right? We're focused on the boundary, making sure the network's good, making sure our cloud environment is good. And if we do have some scanning in the application security side, we'll fix what's critical, maybe, but everything else there's no attention, there's no analysis, right? So when I heard about this, I wasn't surprised. I'm like, okay, until we start focusing more on governing application security and bringing the same rigor that we do to our boundary systems, we will improve in this area and do more preventive measures than always, being detective and running with our hair on fire, waiting for something to happen. So I'm a champion for open source security or application security as a whole to look at vulnerability management more holistically and just move past the boundary. So I wasn't surprised. I'm like, yeah, this is another one and another one until we, drill down and take on the mantle of looking at vulnerability management more holistically.
Yeah. Yeah. So
I
Jordan,
mean,
as an open source maintainer, were you
yeah,
going to have Evan? Sorry, you go.
it was. Yeah, no, it's so my only relationship with XZ was that I maintain NVM, which is the Node version managers, and one of the compression mechanisms that Node uses to distribute itself is XZ. And a number of years ago, it was probably 7 or 8 years ago, some random contributor was like, "Hey, you should use the XZ packages; they're smaller." And so I added in, code to select those whenever XZ was available. So at first, like my first reaction was, "Oh no, am I like somehow implicated by proxy or whatever, and do I have to go deal with something?" I quickly determined that I don't, that even if the XZ binary is compromised on someone's machine, like it's not, NVM has nothing to do with it, it's just using it or not. But then my next immediate reaction was like that, yep, like Shaun said, this is not the first time this has happened. The event stream thing, if I'm recalling correctly, in 2018 was the same deal. It was a maintainer who was just sort of, I'm guessing, burnt out because he makes boats now. He didn't want to maintain this package anymore. Somebody asked for it. He handed it over, and then they snuck in some code, try to steal money out of people's crypto wallets, specific kinds of crypto wallets. And like, that is much less damaging, right? Stealing a specific kind of crypto, like from a specific kind of wallet, like that's still a problem for the people who are stolen from, but like the risk of that is financial purely, right? And also the environments into which event stream is installed are, they're potentially that potentially exposes a lot of vulnerable things, but the particular malicious code wasn't going after any of that. In this case, however, the more I read, right, and it was Easter Sunday, so I had, was only reading in the gaps that I had, but is it the potential, like if this hadn't been caught, the potential that this would have opened up is staggering. And we may never know whether one person or more than one person was involved. We may never know if any nation state was involved or which. There's certainly like circumstantial evidence that may or may not be misinformation that implicates one nation state and two people. But like, if that were the case, then, and this had not been caught, that nation state would potentially be able to log in to any server, like any Linux server all over the world. Like that's huge, right? Like every government should be spending billions of dollars on this problem yesterday. And only a few of them are spending it outside of their own ranks to do so. And I like also what Shaun said about looking for a more holistic approach, because you can't be holistic if you don't take into account the humans involved. And in all of the cases, like there's a list of malicious incidents, like if vulnerabilities that are a result of malice that actually were introduced into highly adopted code. And there's not that many, I think. And I mean, I'm sure someone will disprove me and give me a list of 1,000, but like I have only heard of a few that were high profile, and almost all of them were somebody was burned out and didn't fully vet a new maintainer who then was a bad actor, or somebody was burned out and became a bad actor. And so while it's great if we can come up with technological mitigations, right, ways to catch this faster, to prevent it from getting as far, and so on, that's important, and we should try and do that. But the root cause of this is always the human burden, and I'm really glad Tidelift is helping to alleviate that.
So Rachel, as an industry analyst, thinking out ahead now that this has happened, what are you seeing as the biggest potential impact? Are we going to see more work on the problem?
So I think from RedMonk's perspective, we share a lot of the same concerns that Josh mentioned in terms of just that fear of open source in general. I think open source has been besieged from a lot of angles right now, and supply chain security is definitely one of those. And so I think for me, it was interesting because it felt like basically everyone's preconceived notion about open source was just amplified and confirmed coming into this. So if you came into this being an open source purist and someone who really loved it, you're like, oh gosh, thank goodness that this was open and we had eyes on this and the ability to look at this. And we had a community around able to help. And I think if you're someone who is an open source skeptic or someone who's attacking open source for various reasons, it's look at the vulnerabilities that come in through an open source supply chain ecosystem. And so I think for us, it's really just trying to help people understand the power and importance of open source and helping to make the open source security and open source communities stronger than they are, because I think that they're really important.
Yeah,
And
I think
related,
that's true. Oh, sorry.
no, go ahead.
No, you
Yeah, related to that, Rachel, right? Like I definitely have seen that take, which I'm obviously biased to like, which is that we caught this because it was open source. But I worked at Twitter overlapping with somebody who was a confirmed spy for another country. I think, I don't remember which one. I don't want to guess, but you can Google it. But like, if it seems like if somebody really wanted to infiltrate a company, it's not that tricky to do it. And the only people who could catch it are the people inside that company with access to that system that's compromised. So like, I do think that that is a really important kind of validation of open source, is that, there've been issues in OpenSSL, and that has probably some of the most eyes ever, right? So it's not that more eyes fixes problems or prevents, guarantees that problems won't occur. It's that more eyes drastically increases the chance that someone will figure it out. And I think that's really valuable to protect.
We'll have to
and
call
to
that Jordan's law.
Sure, I'll take it.
I like that. So we've talked about, more eyes, like having that access and the ability to do any sort of auditing on the code, thinking about the people involved, thinking about the boundaries involved. A question I had is, I feel like I've seen a lot of dialogue around, we're going to solve this through more automation, more tooling, reacting faster, and seeing that really accelerate in the age of AI too, right? So now all of these bad actors have access to these tools that help them move faster as well. Are there any other things that y'all would add that create a more full picture of a healthy and secure software supply chain beyond the tooling and the automation? Would you expand on anything else we've touched on?
I'm highly opinionated on this matter. So there's no one thing. I think one of the traps we fall into in the open source world is we talk about open source like a singular entity, and it's not. Open source is literally millions of things that happen to carry a certain software license on them. I mean, Jordan works with NPM. I do all of this analysis work on just the size of open source because from a security perspective, I find it very interesting. And there are literally, millions and millions. There's, I think, 3 million plus NPM packages today, which is a staggering number. When I look at the maintainers, it's like 800,000 people working on this stuff. So it's a mind-bogglingly huge number, and everyone needs something different, right? Some people need a job. Some people need help. They don't want money. They just want help. There's no one thing. And I think that's one of the challenges and terrifying things about all of this is you can't write a check and fix this. You can't push a button and say it's done. It's literally, hundreds of thousands of different problems. And how do we possibly understand or scale that? And I have no idea. It's a huge problem though. And I think the first step is to just recognize there is no easy fix and there is no singular fix here. This is a lot of people and a lot of problems.
Yeah, and I would like to expand on that as well. I think any company that's going to elect to depend on open source to build their applications have a responsibility to monitor the open source environment with tools like Tidelift and others. But the output of that monitoring, build some type of prioritization model where they actually will, do some analysis of risk and impact of some of the more critical CVEs, and then look at other layers, look at the high, look at the moderate, and see if it's going to be something that's impacting their organization. So we know that these different risk ratings, they're more industry wide, right? But you have to have some type of determination of the impact to your own operations, because what may be a medium risk in one area could be a high risk for yours or vice versa. So I think it's having a responsibility and taking the next steps and making sure you optimize your scanning tools by taking the data and actually utilizing that data to be more preventive and making sure you're securing your environment. So I think patching also obviously comes after that. And I know Terrence will have a lot to say about that. But I think it's a responsibility on companies and people who are using these applications to make sure they take appropriate action once they gain visibility to any type of vulnerabilities.
So, and real quick, Terrence, I totally agree with that, but I would even go a step farther and say that companies' existing fiduciary responsibility already compels them to invest in all of their infrastructure, of which open source is a large part of everyone's. And so I think almost every company is failing to do that right now. And like the analysis and monitoring is a core piece, of course, but they need to go farther than that, and they need to ensure that open source is sustainable as part of their fiduciary obligation to their shareholders.
Yes, I agree. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the conversation and the discussion has to it has to leak outside of the software and the security circles, because the individuals leading businesses need to have a understanding of what the actual risk is, and that the fact that it is it is not a primarily technical discussion. And I think we have to bring the business, non-technical individuals into the room and explain to them why this matters outside of software development world.
Yes, and I think that's basically being able to articulate a level of business impact, whether it's financial, reputational, stock, being able to tie outcomes to actual business goals and objectives. I think that definitely would get the attention, at the C and executive level of any organization. And that will definitely, rise this particular subject to the level that's needed to really impact change.
So I want to talk about a little bit of what you touched on earlier, Rachel, with the concern, and Josh, you touched on this as well, the concern that people would sort of lose faith in open source or sort of react against open source. And of course, there's a reality that nobody can or should try to rip all the open source out of their organization. But this feels, for those that were sort of conceptually close to what happened here, it feels like a really seminal moment for trust being eroded in open source. And I wonder, what do y'all think, that is there any damage coming out of this, and what can be done about that?
I think the problem that we have with open source right now is that it's under attack from a lot of angles. They have proprietary license moves coming up from some companies who are single vendor open source providers. We have a lot of questions around what open source looks like in a world of AI. And then we have attacks like this so I feel like right now open source is in a more precarious place than it has been for a while, in terms of just general stability and general belief in the movement overall. And so for me, I think a lot of it is people need to be the standard bearer for open source overall. I would love to see people supporting the OSI more. I would love to see people coming together to actually rally around the importance of truly open software. So if you want to have proprietary software, great. But if you want to have your software be open source, then that means something, and it needs to mean something to the people who are making it and to the people who are using it. And so I think all of these things together are things that we need to be standing and gathering around open source on. And so part of this is, yes, we need to be making sure that people feel comfortable, confident in the security of the software they're using. That's part of like the XD attack in particular. But I think also it's just like making people value, like I think we haven't really had like the value of open source in the enterprise kind of was a discussion that happened. I think people thought it was a discussion that happened in the past and have assumed that it's a given. And I think that people need to kind of remember that this is not something that is necessarily and indefinitely secure, and we need to continue fighting for open source overall.
Yeah, I wonder, what role each one of us can play in our different day-to-day in terms of advocating for the visibility of what open source is driving at these businesses. Shaun, you mentioned the tying it to that business level outcome and really showing the C-suite as an example what open source continuously drives every single day at their organization.
Was it Josh at the top? I'm sorry if I forgot who it was who was saying, like, open source is here to stay in the enterprise at this point. Like, we cannot pull it back out. At this point, the genie is out of the bottle. So it's, what are we going to do to make this work for everybody, I think, is the question. And what kind of tooling, what kind of investment, like, all of these questions are questions we should be answering. But hopefully nobody is at the point of trying to rip out Linux. I'm hoping.
No, they're not. I mean, it's too many enterprise applications that's so dependent on open source code. But I think, what we're doing now, having communities to bring awareness to open source, not just some of the things that can happen from a security perspective, but the value of open source, the business value of having your own software versus some SaaS vendor where you don't have control of releases or functionality, having those conversations. And I know there are communities already open source, but just maybe expanding communities to, get in front at different conferences and just talking about what's good about open source and how it really can have a positive impact on operations. So it's just really bringing the benefits and value more out front than talking about all of the problems. Because I mean, when I hear open source, the first thing is all of the problems, but really not honing in on the benefits. And I think that awareness would definitely help with the adoption of open source. I think that would be helpful.
I think there's another weird angle to this as well, kind of building off what Shaun and Rachel just said. And I'm going to point at you, Jordan, for this one. You said you work with NVM, which is an open source project for handling Node versions. And anyone who works with Node knows exactly what they run NVM, 100% guaranteed. Now, we talk about getting involved and understanding what we have and everything. If 1,000 people showed up to NVM and were like, we want to help, what would happen?
I mean, that would be amazing. That'd be
would it though?
999 more. I mean, it would be a lot, certainly. But I immediately have projects that need to be done. I have labeled issues like pull request wanted. Go fix those. Can you make something faster? Go make it faster. Can you write new tests? Go write new tests, right? Like there's lots of work to be done. And at some point, in theory, one or more of those people will have demonstrated the stamina, enthusiasm, and interpersonal skills that it would be worth making them a co-maintainer. Obviously, one of the unfortunate downsides of this XZ thing is now I have to look at people with more distrust than I'm comfortable using and employing. And I have to kind of think real hard about who I give permissions of things to. But in the age of video calls, I mean, it would be much harder, although not impossible, for someone to kind of bluff their way through multiple face-to-face interactions, even if they're over, a computer. But yeah, I mean, I think the other thing for NVM is that the like worst case like run book for me is that I own the org and the OpenJS Foundation owns that, and also one of these additional maintainers wouldn't own the org. They would only have permissions on the repo. So like I can think about it in those terms of like if I ended up making someone a maintainer and they did something bad, like I can just like take away their access and push different commits, right? But yeah, so and that kind of illustrates some of the boundary stuff that Shaun was talking about. But it does unfortunately add friction to the part where like the reason that I'm the only maintainer on NVM is not because I don't want more maintainers. And in fact, there have been other people maintaining it in the past. It's because nobody else has stuck around. And like people show up, make a contribution or two, and then they kind of fade away. And that's true on all my projects. And, even the ones that have multiple maintainers, the other maintainers are not very active. And, that's fine. I don't begrudge them that they have a life or other, things to do. But yeah, I've never had the problem of too many people before. And to your earlier comment, I've also never had the problem of too much money. So while lots of money certainly wouldn't fix it, money does fix a lot of problems. Money, in fact, does provably buy happiness up to a point. There's lots of studies on it, right? So like, if 1,000 people showed up, or, gobs of money showed up, I could easily make a company and hire people just to like manage the software and use that more kind of understood organization structure to do it, right? But yeah, it's hard to theorize about a situation that's never happened to me before. But
Yeah.
my best guess is that I would be very pleased and overwhelmed, but also like optimistic.
Yeah. And Jordan, to your point, like one of the big value propositions of Tidelift is the pay the maintainer advantage. And I think to your point, although money doesn't solve everything, that could be a good incentive for more maintainers to stick around and lend their expertise to make sure we have a safe and secure open source environment.
Yeah. The way I've often phrased it recently is that the important thing is to relieve the capital burden on maintainers. You can do that in a lot of ways. You can give them a job. You can hand them a pile of cash. You can give them tax credits. You can give them free health insurance or discounts on things, right? Like there's lots of ways to achieve that. But and then once their capital burden is fully relieved, then you can go even farther and give them the ability to relieve others' capital burdens to help them with their problem. So I do think that for someone who is motivated to go in that direction, I think just continually pouring money on that person will in fact solve problems. It's just not everybody is motivated in that way, as Josh has indicated, right? There's lots of different philosophies and ideologies and motivations and constraints, and everybody's got different stuff going on. Yeah, I think Tidelift's approach is certainly, I think, a very critical piece to a holistic approach to solve these problems.
Yes, I concur.
In terms of damage, I would say, never let a incident or near incident go to waste. So when it comes to resources, bodies and money, this is the opportunity to have the discussions and make sure that we are thinking about the what if, what if this does eventually happen in some set of conditions down the road, then what do we do?
I think that's also, I think people are, well, what if this is already happening elsewhere? It's like that when you're seeing this years long lead up, it definitely makes one question that.
Sure.
Well, the circumstantial evidence I referred to is like some chat about somebody claiming at the time that the XC thing was noticed, claiming that they still had another project that they were working on, right? Who knows if that's valid or not, and not who knows if that's even the right person. But I think it's a very real and plausible concern that there are other ongoing attempts in various stages of completion, and some of them may have already been deployed widely.
Yes, I mean it's unconfirmed at this point if this was actually the work of a nation state, again, like which it would be, et cetera. Although, again, the sophistication and the long game, especially compared with your experience, Jordan, of people making a contribution leaving, would certainly suggest some, persistence, right? That could be driven
There
by
appears to
nation
have
state.
been some capital contribution, as Jordan would have.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. What can we tell our audience that gives us hope right now about the scale? Josh, you talked about the scale of open source, right? And just all of these different nodes, and those nodes are people, and many of those people are by themselves. How can we expect maintainers to defend and to be hard to get this against these things? Like what is the right answer here?
For me, it's that humans are basically good. This is something that I like I was at Airbnb for a while, and that's like something the company believes. And that matches my experience, is that most people are basically good. And while it's very useful to try and provide non-human solutions, technical solutions to solve problems, I think the hope is try to lean on people, try to like help people do better, and you'll get better from them, right? It's the reason why people at companies that have better benefits are more productive, right? It's because they feel valued, and so they are more effective and they are more productive, right? And I think if anything that we can do that simply makes open source maintainers in this case feel valued, that can be any number of things, not just money, right? Then they will produce better output. They will be more effective. They will be more rigorous. They will be more thorough, and that's something that everybody on the planet can do. Even just reaching out and a kind word, right? That's not going to pay my rent, but it's definitely going to make me feel a little better. So that's my angle for hope.
I think there's a lot of reasons to be hopeful. And I know it's easy to have a conversation like this and just pile on the doom and gloom, and it feels like, oh my goodness, the world is going to end or whatever. But there's a lot of moving parts in this puzzle, but there's a lot of good happening. I'll point like the work Tidelift is doing. You've got groups like the Sovereign Tech Fund over in Germany that are doing some amazing work right now. There's organizations starting to try to understand like what does open source look like? How is this working? The Atlantic Council released a report, I think last year, that talked about viewing open source as like infrastructure, as maybe like a natural resource, comparing it to roads and bridges or the water or whatever, things like that. There's so much research happening. There's so much conversation now happening around how can we kind of structure what we're trying to do in the open source universe in a way that is sustainable and helpful. And so it's not going to be fast. It's going to take a long time. I mean, the analogy I always use is the air brakes on trains. Before that, they had people would run around on the tops of trains to twist those wheels to turn the brakes on, and people died constantly. It was super unsafe, as you can imagine. It took 80 years from the invention of air brakes until people finally said, all right, we got to use these things. Like, this is ridiculous. So we can't expect, 2025 is a year of solving open source's problems. But the reality is, like, we're at least on the path. And that gives me a lot of hope. But I also recognize that we're not going to be measuring this in years. We're probably going to be measuring this in decades. So we also have to temper our expectations.
Yep, that makes sense.
Yeah,
Shaun, what about you? Oh, sorry, Terrence.
No, I was just gonna say it's we call it a chain for a reason, and there are multiple links in the chain, and I would say occasionally one link gets broken or damaged, but it doesn't mean the whole chain is to be thrown away.
Yeah. Are there any lessons that anybody's taking away from XE in particular? Things that you plan to do differently, or think about differently, or push your team at Boeing differently, or your customers at Anchore, or customers at BlackIce differently, or the folks that you advise at RedMonk?
I think this is also, maybe this is naive and maybe it's a reason to hope, but I'm hoping like one of the elements of this attack was like the sock puppet, like account badgering and bullying. Like, I'm hopeful that maybe this can make us all as a community, like, be a little bit kinder, a little bit more useful, like if only just so that you don't get accused of being a nation state actor. But like also like maybe we can get to a point where like we are interacting with each other better. That's my hope for the community overall. And I think for me, in terms of organizationally, like I'm hoping that this leads to a lot more investment in open source just infrastructure at all. Like Microsoft should be absolutely commended for having employed the person who was able to effectively save us all on this one. And so hopefully we have a lot more people who see that and are willing to make similar investments.
I think the angle I view kind of from, what to expect with, dealing with customers and community members and things like that is from my perspective is you have to understand what you have in your infrastructure and in your products. I think we, for a long time, treated open source as just like free stuff anyone can go and use, but it's free like a puppy, right? Where if you have a product, if you have infrastructure, you can't just like take whatever you feel like and throw it in there. Like you have to know what it is. I'm not saying should tell your developers, oh, you can't use any open source or have. There's literally, I know someone whose company has an open source approval committee, and it takes a quarter to get approved to use like one thing from open. Like that's also ridiculous. So there's a sliding bar here we do have to figure out. But I think fundamentally, like knowing what you have is super important.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and I will also say too, like just inviting more personas into the conversation. When we think of the software life cycle, it's really the developers and those roles that support development, engineers, but the individuals outside of that would definitely need to have a knowledge and understanding of risk related to open source. So they'll know not to use certain utilities. Like, for example, with this XZ issue, it was for file compression. I know that developers use it a lot, but people and regular users will use that as well, not even thinking about risk that they could be bringing into the organization. So from a security perspective, maybe you limit the use of certain utilities to kind of proactively manage risk in that area. But then again, just awareness. I mean, typically when something happens, when there's a breach, the first thing all companies do is make sure they're not vulnerable to that same issue, that they don't have that same issue in their environment. And again, that's reactive, I admit, but just thinking of like, no one would think of a utility just compressing files could be something that will cause, enterprise-wide reach and exposure, but it can. So it's just bringing more visibility to the things that we don't think about, things that may be in our blind spots, such as things like that.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I would love to see more usage of, like the NPM ecosystems had lock files for a decade, but like SBOMs are a more general form of this, and everyone should be using them. You should be able to immediately answer the question, like that thing has just been found to be vulnerable. Are we using that thing and where?
A lot of organizations don't even have the visibility to their SBOMs at all. They have no tool that can really get them the visibility they need. So that's one of the problems when it comes to awareness, making, organizations aware that there are solutions to give you better visibility of your SBOMs so that you can do that level of discovery and research proactively or reactively if something occurs.
Right. I mean, the other thing you pointed out was like, what do you do? How do you prevent things coming in? Right. There's the big concept in security is like moat-based defense, right? You want to have a bunch of layers.
Right.
Each of these is almost like a checkpoint where it's a chance to mitigate problems. And for example, when XZ changed maintainers, who knew that? How many people on the planet were even aware that a new person was involved? That's not always a red flag. I've taken over plenty of projects, and I would be in, anything that detected this would detect me taking over a project. But somebody should be aware and should be able to vet people and look at it and say, this person is already a good actor in the ecosystem or not. Has this person done anything else, or is this the only thing they're doing? Let's, if they're new to the ecosystem, maybe let's monitor their activity for a period of time, right? And then kind of see what's going on. There's just not a lot of, the alerting that there is creates too much noise and not enough signal. And the alerting that we need is not very popular or existent. And, I still maintain that like solving the human problem is the most important thing, but it is definitely not the lowest hanging fruit. That would be automated tooling. So I think there's a lot of directions that we could go here to make things better.
Yeah, great points.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we're fortunate to live in an age, right? Hopefully we're a little bit deep into our decades of work that Josh has told us about, where these tools are going to help us get this awareness faster, the visibility, the actionability, and then we get to decide what is the action we're going to take next. So I really appreciate everybody's time here today. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their day at Upstream.
Awesome. Thank you.
Bye.
Happy to be here. Thanks, everyone.